Greetings and welcome to Over the Target. I'm Lee Smith. We have a really interesting show this morning. It's the major foreign policy disaster of the Joe Biden administration. And these are two authors of a new book, and this book is great. It's called Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco. Let me just make sure I got it right. And the American warriors who fought to the end. The authors are James Hassan and Jerry Dunleavy, and they're here with us this morning. And gentlemen, again, congratulations on this fantastic book. And everyone, you got to go out there and read it to understand not just what happened at the end, the catastrophic withdrawal, but the end of a 20-year conflict that was mismanaged throughout. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thanks, Lee. Good to be here.
James, Jerry, again, congratulations on a really great book, really important book, covering a really important historical moment. And I'm talking, of course, about the withdrawal as well as the conflict. One of the things I want to get to right away is you guys start off. We've heard how many times Biden has miscalculated on foreign policy. Robert Gates, former defense secretary, former CIA director, famously said that Joe Biden has been wrong about every foreign policy issue of, I guess it would now be the last half century. What I didn't know, and what's really amazing, you guys started off, and this is a really a brilliant way to tell the book. You talk about Biden's position on Vietnam. So, I didn't know. I didn't know that that it was this fanatically wrong on Vietnam. Can you guys touch on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book begins with, I think, what is an incredible foreshadowing of what was to come in
Hmm.
Afghanistan and just perfectly predicted why Biden was going to screw up in Afghanistan, especially when it came to the betrayal of our Afghan allies, the people that had fought beside us for 20 years. Because when Biden joined the Senate as a young man back in the 70s, he kind of joined a little bit too late to be part of the real anti-war movement. And so the war was winding down. And actually the North Vietnamese were on the march, marching towards Saigon to take South Vietnam. And President Biden, then a senator, tried to make his mark by being the most vocal
Hmm.
politician in America, attempting to keep South Vietnamese allies out of the country. Essentially, President Gerald Ford at the time, the war is ending. North Vietnam is marching towards Saigon, sweeping towards the city, and Ford is trying to get out a lot of our South Vietnamese allies. And Biden in the Senate tried to stop any of them from being able to escape South Vietnam and come to the United States. A quote that we dug up from him from the congressional archives was something to the effect of, this is almost the exact quote. He said, "We don't have a moral obligation to one or 100,001 South Vietnamese." And so that was his position. Now, luckily, he did not win the day there. And the United States, under Republican President Ford, did get a lot of South Vietnamese allies out, but we also didn't get some out. And a lot of the ones that were left behind, as we know, ended up in re education camps, labor camps, tortured, sometimes killed, right? And then you fast forward to him becoming president, and you see that attitude, that just not caring attitude return. And I think that it helps explain, at least partly, why Biden did what he did, and especially why he did it the way he did, why he was willing to just abandon tens of thousands of Afghan allies that we had made promises to, and also, by the way, leave many hundreds, well over 1,000 Americans left behind as well. Because when it comes to this stuff, when he wants out, it's out, and all other considerations are gone.
Yeah, if I can just add to that a little bit, yeah, the everything that Jerry said was completely spot on, and you could also see that reflected in conversations that Vice President Biden had with then Vice President Biden with President Obama. Uh, Richard Holbrooke, who's now passed away, but wrote in his memoirs about how Biden was pressuring Obama to just completely withdraw. And Holbrooke interjected, "Well, what about all of the allies that we've made promises to
Mm.
What about the women who are going to be under the Taliban? And Biden responded, "Screw that. We got away with it in Saigon, didn't we?"
Right.
And so that's, I mean, this is who he is, and this decision, as we lay out in Kabul, from start to finish, this was vintage Joe Biden, unfortunately.
Well, one of the things that you guys do a very good job. I mean, again, it's a great book, but I just want to focus on a couple things in particular. You make a very solid case that Biden, and this is part of the conversation with Holbrooke. I believe he tells Holbrooke, that you don't know anything about politics. Well, what was so important about politics with the hastened withdrawal here, right? I mean, was the Democratic Party base obsessed with getting out of Afghanistan the way that Joe Biden seems to be portraying it? If that's true, I wasn't aware of it. So that's why it struck me as strange that Biden is constantly obsessed with these optics.
Uh,
Yeah, I think I can't speak for what the base wanted, but
Hmm.
certainly through his eyes, this was something that was politically advantageous.
Hmm.
It was something that he absolutely wanted to do, I think, regardless. And and you can see that even in the date that he originally set for the final withdrawal of American troops, which was originally set in Biden's April 2021 speech announcing a pullout. It was set for September 11th,
Hmm.
2021, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And, it's kind of mind boggling why he would think that that was somehow a great symbolic date to choose, but it definitely wasn't chosen based on strategy. And what it meant was that the entire time we were withdrawing, we were doing so in the middle of the Afghan fighting season, which is when uh, the mountain passes between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the snow all melts, and they become passable again. And we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. Everybody knows that it ramps up in the spring and summer, and it cools back down in the winter. So while we were kicking the legs out from the Afghan military, the fighting was at its peak. So this was simply politically a top to bottom decision. You can
Hmm.
see that in the decision to abandon Bagram as well. But I'll kick it over to Jerry because it looked like he wanted to say
Yeah, I thought
something too.
Jerry.
I mean, all that I would say is that it's very clear that President Biden wanted to make his mark on the war in Afghanistan, right?
Hmm.
He felt like the military generals, didn't think much of him. He had a giant chip on his shoulder when it came to that, and so he wasn't willing to listen to anyone that told him, "Hey, if you do this the
Hmm.
way you're proposing doing it, it's going to be a disaster." And keep in mind also in terms of making a mark on Afghanistan, he was pretty much the only person that opposed the raid to kill Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, as well. And so he was on the wrong side of what you know a lot of people thought was kind of a big win in the war on terrorism and our engagement in Afghanistan. And so, just like with Vietnam, where he was trying to make his mark, and he tried to make his mark by, trying to keep South Vietnamese refugees and allies out. I think he just wanted to make his mark on Afghanistan. He had been ignored on it as
Hmm.
vice president, and this is how he thought that he could make his mark and get some sort of big symbolic win on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in his first year of the presidency. But by picking the Afghan fighting season, by doing the withdrawal the way that he did,
Hmm.
what he ensured was that by the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, the Taliban, the group that had harbored Al Qaeda in the 90s as they attacked U.S. embassies in 2000, as they hit the USS Cole, and then obviously in 2001 as they hit the United States and killed 3,000 people and beyond. I mean, the Taliban was willing to spend 20 years out in the hinterlands, out of power, out in the cold, rather than break that alliance with Al Qaeda.
Hmm.
But Biden, by picking that date and picking the middle of the Afghan fighting season, he ensured that group, the Taliban, Al Qaeda's allies, were back in charge on the 20th anniversary.
James, I want to ask you because I know you served in Afghanistan, and it's not just that I want to get your insight on when you were there, because one of the things that a lot of people have said is that yes, Joe Biden blundered getting out of Afghanistan, but for a long time people had blundered through this conflict, and you guys described very clearly how there were problems with the way the Trump administration handled this as well as and their envoy to the situation, Azal Khalilzad, who is in the middle of a lot of problems dating back certainly before the George W. Bush years, but that's where he really kind of made his name as blundering through Middle Eastern theaters and causing diplomatic problems for the United States. So I guess what I'm saying was is the fundamental problem that no one took control of this situation after the first couple of years in Afghanistan. No one said, look, we got to figure out how to win this. We got to figure out how to win it and get it out. So in a sense, was it inevitable? Has this been teed up for 20 years for Joe Biden to blunder as disastrously as he did?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Certainly there are 20 years of mistakes that were made. Whether it was taking our eye off the ball and going into Iraq a few years later and kind of letting Afghanistan be the forgotten war, whether it was kind of transitioning into this nation building model that clearly 20 years of evidence shows that it didn't work, but and so there were good arguments on both sides, I think, for why people wanted to leave completely, wanted to stay, wanted to kind of have just a narrow footprint. But at the end of the day, and this is a point that we make in Kabul just right at the outset, it really doesn't matter how which side of that argument you come down on, because the way that this withdrawal happened, the disastrous effects that it had, with thousands of Americans left behind, tens of thousands of Afghan allies left behind, America humiliated on the world stage, and 13 American service members killed and dozens more wounded, some permanently. That was all at the feet of President Biden and the Obama administration, or the Biden administration in particular, whether it's Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin. And so even if you're going to withdraw, it was the way that this was handled, starting with giving up Bagram, starting with and then failing to plan after that. The embassy, the State Department wasn't even making plans for an evacuation until a couple of days beforehand, even though the writing was clearly on the wall. And so if you can think of a way to screw this up, they did it, and it had tragic consequences.
And let me just grab the Doha piece real quick. So
please,
we're very clear in the book. Like, the Doha agreement was a very flawed agreement, the agreement that was struck between the U.S. and the Taliban during the Trump administration. Very flawed. There were conditions in it, though. I mean, there really were. And the obvious one, that the Taliban was breaking every single piece of the Doha agreement, and we lay that out in the book, meaning that the United States was under no obligation to follow it itself, of course. But the most important one that I talked about earlier is obviously this alliance between the Taliban and Al Qaeda was never broken. In fact, Siraj Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, is also one of the most powerful leaders in the Taliban, and by many is considered to be essentially a card-carrying member of Al Qaeda himself, to say nothing of the fact that some members of the current Taliban government are also considered to be dual-hatted members of the Taliban and Al Qaeda. So the Taliban was not following the Doha agreement, flawed as it was. And so the U.S. was not obligated to do really anything in particular. We certainly weren't obligated to withdraw by some date certain, because the Taliban was not following through on what it had agreed to do. And what we point out in the book is that the main architect of the Doha agreement, as you mentioned, Lee, was Zal Khalilzad. And Zal, from pretty much everybody that we talked to that worked with him in various intelligence and national security roles, basically described him as a pretty pernicious figure, not trustworthy, and a damaging presence when it came to U.S. foreign policy. And, the Biden administration's main excuse when it comes to how they screwed up in Afghanistan so badly, really their only defense is to try and point to the Doha Agreement, which, as I've laid out, we didn't have to follow. But they kept the architect of the Doha Agreement on immediately.
Right.
It was the first, and I think one of the most important personnel decisions that they made related to Afghanistan was Secretary Blinken declaring that Zal was going to stay on, that he was going to remain America's man in Afghanistan, and Blinken praising his vital work, right? So, there you go. The Biden administration immediately embraced who I think was probably the most flawed player on the U.S. side of the Afghan conflict at that time. And so the Biden administration can't really escape its responsibility here because it embraced it really. And at the end of the day, this was a decision that President Biden made. I think a lot of fair questions get raised about President Biden's age and whether he's, making every single decision in the White House. But when it came to Afghanistan, read Kabul and you'll see this was Biden top to bottom.
Fascinating. And it's a fascinating book. It's a great book. Jerry and James, we have to cut away for a moment. Viewers, if you are watching on YouTube or Facebook, please make the jump with us. We're going to Epoch TV exclusively. Please make the jump. Don't miss a single second of this really important conversation with Jerry Dunleavy, James Hassan, authors of Kabul. Really fantastic book. Join us. We'll be away less than a minute. Make the jump, please. See you in a sec. The center of corruption is the Department of Justice. Charles Grassley, FBI and DOJ withheld evidence from the American people, from Congress, for 6 years regarding Biden family corruption. Where is the rest of Congress?
Senator Grassley, and joined by Chairman Comer, who's on the House side, they wrote a letter basically to the FBI and said, we are aware of the existence of a form that contains allegations regarding a bribery scheme involving Joe Biden himself. Then it turns out, hey, the document's real. They got it. There were 17 phone calls that the source had recorded involving Joe Biden or Hunter Biden talking about the bribery scheme. The FBI redacted that information to the American people. This is the FBI we're talking about. This is corruption of the president we're talking about. It's you get the documents, you get the witnesses, you get them under oath, you move forward. You don't play on their terms, you play on your terms.